can. We're going to hopefully record them now. So we will run them intermittently, repeats during the summertime, whereas where we give our talks again that you'll have heard already, and we'll advertise them through the meetup. But maybe some of you will join in, even though you may have heard the talk already. But we just want to record them so that we have them on the site for posterity or whatever. So because we've such a wealth of talks from the Antarctic to the Liffey Bridges, and it's such a shame that we don't have them recorded. So we'll kickstart that during the summertime, and you'll see it on the meetup anyway. Next thing, as I say, is recorded. Everyone is muted. I just want to introduce Aveen. Aveen, would you believe, is my little sister. So she doesn't look like me, but when you hear her voice, we've been told that we have the same voice. So like me, Aveen is a tour guide, and she has a particular interest in this subject in Northern Ireland. So of course I've taught her everything she knows. I hope she realises that. So I let her talk. It's 8:10, so I better get moving on it. So I think that's all I have to say. Christine has said her bit. So sit back and relax, and we'll hear about World War II in the north of Ireland. Go ahead, Aveen.
Okay, thank you, Ger. Well, I promise not to sit back and relax, or I'll never get through this. I'll try and keep it in under the hour, because I know, Obama himself couldn't keep you entertained for much longer than that. So I'll try and keep it neat and in under the hour. Okay, yeah. I had an interest in this subject, and the reason I know a bit about it is that I actually chose it as my final exam for when I was doing the tour guiding course. But my reason for picking the Second World War in Northern Ireland primarily came from the fact we were given a number of subjects, and I picked that one. That I had grown up with it in my family, both Ger and I. Whereas in Ireland, most people talk about the war years as being the emergency. We always called it the war years, and the reason for that was that our father had been an Englishman who was stationed in Northern Ireland during the war from 1940 onwards and until 45. Or until 44, where he met our mother and got married, and that's how we came to have that background, if you like. So the war years were quite a subject in our family for that reason. So there's a couple of things I'd just like you to think of in relation before I start in, because to my mind, most people in the Republic, let's say the Republic as opposed to Northern Ireland, wouldn't tend to think of the World War as something that happened in Ireland, and yet it did. It actually happened in Northern Ireland because they were impacted. They were part of the UK and they were impacted by the war. So can I just ask, my dishwasher is on in the background. Is it making an interrupting noise? Because I can turn it off.
No, it's fine.
Okay, that's grand. Okay, I can just hear it gurgling from time to time. So when you think about it, the war broke out in 1939, and that was only 17 years after partition. So if you allow for the fact that not everybody in Northern Ireland wanted partition, if you're a Northern Ireland nationalist, you felt quite aggrieved that this Anglo-Irish agreement in 21 had effectively had left you behind. In other words, we got our independent Ireland, but if you lived in one of the 6 counties, you were left behind, and that's the way they would have looked at it. Obviously, Unionists didn't, but Nationalists did. So by very virtue of that partition and being left behind, if you like, they now found themselves in the eye of a storm because war broke out in 39. Again, I think that if you ask the average Irish person in the street, was Ireland involved in the Second World War? They'd say no, we had an emergency here, we didn't have that. And equally, if you said to them, but was Ireland bombed in the Second World War? They'd say, oh yeah, the North Strand, there was this accidental bombs dropped on the North Strand, and I think about 30 odd people died in that bombing. What they probably wouldn't know is that Belfast had the second highest death rate for one night of bombing, passed out only by London. The second highest of all the UK cities like Manchester, Liverpool, these cities were flattened during the Battle of Britain, but yet the second highest death rate for one night happened in Belfast, and it was only beaten by London, which, as we know, had a very hard time during the Battle of Britain. But it's easy to see why Belfast was a target, because they were producing quite a lot for the war effort. Harland and Wolff were producing battleships. Shorts aircraft were producing military aircraft for the RAF. So there was munitions produced in Northern Ireland, and then some, if you like, the softer side in the terms of uniforms, parachutes, etc. So Northern Ireland was very much part of the war effort, if you like. It had a big impact too on Northern Ireland's economy, which in the pre-war years was a very, very poor and very disadvantaged economy. But because of the demand on the shipbuilding, the linen industry and aircraft manufacture, their economy boomed. So whereas unemployment was 30%, imagine 30% unemployment in 1939, it had dropped to 5% by 1945 because of people being employed in, if you like, the war effort as such. Again, I had mentioned earlier, shipbuilding was a big issue. The Harland and Wolff shipbuilding ground was very, very busy. It was a very big industry there at the time, and obviously they were pressed into service to produce vessels for the war effort. And also in Harland and Wolff pre-war years, the average wage, should I say, was only about 60% of the UK average. So people were not being well paid. It was very much a backwater economically. So Harland and Wolff had produced during the war years, they produced 150 warships, 6 aircraft carriers, and 123 merchant ships. They were also involved in a small way in tank building, which you can see the photograph up there, but I think that was on a much smaller scale. At the same time, then the Shorts aircraft manufacturing plant were set up to produce bomber aircraft, and the linen industry switched from the linens it had been producing to produce parachutes, uniforms, and tents for soldiers. So as you can see, very, very much involved in the war effort for the UK overall. There was also some munitions produced in one of the smaller Northern Ireland towns. It wasn't very large industry, but there were some munitions, and you can see somebody there. It looks like something like perhaps anti-tank weapons. I'm not good on my military hardware, I'm afraid. And then the famous Derry girls, as we know, the shirt factory of Derry. Well, you know, from the song "The Town I Love So Well," the shirt industry in Derry was a very big industry and employed exclusively women, or well, almost exclusively women, but it was a very important industry for Derry, which was a very, very depressed city in terms of employment. So the Derry girls, as they were known, or as we know from the recent comedy, if you've ever seen it, Derry girls produced 15 million shirts, 15 million shirts for British Army soldiers in the war. And they actually had they used to write little verses, just something they did for a joke. They would write a little verse and put it in the pocket of the shirt for the soldier to find when it came to it. Used to make them up themselves. But there is one I have here that was a popular one that they wrote, and it was, "The shirt was made by a Derry girl whose lips are made for kissing. So hurry up and win the war, you don't know what you're missing." That was one of the verses that you would find in them. Agricultural production also boomed because, again, you know, with food shortages during war, when shipping is disrupted, they needed to press all that into service. So the agricultural industry boomed, and food production actually tripled between the years of 39 to 45. But the biggest impact, apart from the economic impact, probably another great impact on it was the arrival of troops. Northern Ireland was a staging post for both British and American troops at a later stage. As you know, America didn't enter the war initially, but in 1940, after Dunkirk, when, as you know, the British Expeditionary Forces, they were known, had to hot-tail it out of France and return to Britain, the British found themselves with thousands of enlisted men and some women who all had to be housed. The army camps were full to capacity, and these people were hardly any of them were trained. It was literally the start of the war, so they had to get them all trained. So people were actually moved to Northern Ireland camps to be housed and trained there. The US troops, of course, didn't arrive until they entered the war, which was December 41. But as early as January 1942, the troops, 300,000 US troops, arrived in Northern Ireland that January, literally within 5-6 weeks of war being declared on Japan and on Germany. And by the time the war was complete, by the time the end of the war, 300,000 US troops had travelled through Northern Ireland, had come to Northern Ireland, been trained there, and moved on to France then with the opening of Europe in 44. But probably the thing that was most affected people in Northern Ireland, because it was so tragic, was a thing called the Belfast Blitz. And this is where the reference I made earlier to the terrible loss of life. The Belfast Blitz covers the 4 separate bombing raids that were held, that happened in Northern Ireland, and were all aimed at Britain, or at Belfast, sorry. The reason they were aimed at Belfast was, as I say, you had the Shorts manufacturing and you had the Harland and Wolff going on there. So they were contributing to the war effort, and that made them a target. Belfast City was actually very poorly defended. And the reason for that was the British authorities believed that it couldn't be reached by German bombers. And in fact, they were right about that at the start of the war. The German aircraft simply weren't capable of flying full of bombs all the way from German airfields all the way to Belfast. They simply hadn't got that range to get there and back. However, what the British authorities didn't take into account was that after the fall of France and Holland, after they were occupied, the Germans now had access to French and Dutch airfields, which, you know, shortened the journey probably by a couple of 100 miles. So as a result, they were in a position to be able to make it as far as Northern Ireland. So there were 4 air raids in total over the course in 1940. They all happened in April and May of 1940, but the one that was the most serious one was on Tuesday, the 15th of April. It was Tuesday. It was the Tuesday after Easter, and people were still in a kind of an Easter holiday mood, I suppose. Yeah. Now first, I'll just snip back there. On that day, the 15th of April, that afternoon, there had been football supporters were watching a match in Windsor Park, and in the afternoon, when a Luftwaffe aircraft flew overhead. Now, the pilot was probably on a reconnaissance mission, having a look at the place in daylight, but he flew overhead and people observed that had happened. But it was later that night that the raid was to occur when everyone was in bed. So during that night, 150 aircraft took off from air bases in both France and occupied Holland. And initially, as they flew into overhead the city, they first attacked the waterworks and destroyed the waterworks. That was to have a big impact because it meant that the water pressure was so low for the fire brigade, they simply weren't able to, fight the fires well. 3 ships under construction in the Harland and Wolff shipyard were bombed. Now, as you know, in those days, people didn't tend to commute very far to work. And where you had a big industry like a shipbuilding industry or a shipyard, you tended to have houses in the street surrounding, those little 2 up, 2 down, red brick, rows upon rows of terraced houses. And that's where the Harland and Wolff workers tended to be. Now, precision bombing was not of the order at that time. They didn't simply have the technology for that. So you rarely, when you drop bombs, it was rather random almost. You had your target, you let go of the bombs and you hope they'd land on their targets. So as a result, a lot of the bombs simply fell on the houses, surrounding houses of the shipyards. And the bombing continued all night. They also dropped quite a few incendiaries. Now, apparently, if an incendiary dropped at your feet and you had a bucket of sand, you could throw the incendiary into the bucket of sand and kill it off. However, these incendiaries landed on the roofs of lots of houses, and as a result, they set the houses alight. So streets upon streets of houses were blazing, bombs were falling. It was just an incredible, terrible, terrible night. Probably one of the greatest tragedies of that night was a place called Burke Street, and Burke Street was just one street of 2 rows of houses, and it was wiped. Literally every house in that street was wiped out. The following morning, there was not a single resident of that street alive. Not one person survived it. The street was just a street of rubble, and it was just one long street of people who had all died in the bombing. Terrible tragedy to think of, a whole street of neighbours being wiped out like that. And equally, you could imagine if you had lived on that street and just weren't home that night, you could come back to find that not only were your family gone, but your whole street of houses and all your neighbours. So quite an incredible tragedy for them. The loss of life that night in total was 900 people, 1,500 were injured, 55,000 houses were damaged, and left 100,000 people homeless. And that's the night that I referred to earlier, was the second biggest loss of life to any city next to London. The impact, of course, was huge on the city of Belfast size and the sophistication of the time. The mortuary simply couldn't cope with the number of corpses that they had, and they had to open up. I think it was a public bath in the Falls Road, and they had to store some of the bodies there initially. Within a few days of the bombing, there were 100 bodies still unidentified, simply just couldn't be identified. So they had the problem then of having to bury these people in mass graves unidentified, which is obviously a very difficult thing for the families who never got to identify them. But of course, being Northern Ireland, they had the added pressure of religion, because it tended in the north, it tended to be that Catholics bury their dead in Milltown and Protestants bury their dead in the city graveyard. But as the bodies were unidentified, they simply couldn't be sure. So they had to do the best they could, but they simply just split them between 2 graveyards. And it meant then that the families weren't sure which mass grave actually involved their families. But they did check the bodies. For instance, if a body had a rosary beads or a miraculous medal or something like that, they were assumed to be Catholics. And in the absence of that, they were possibly just assumed to be Protestants. That's how random it had to be. So a terrible night for Belfast. Equally, the hospital facilities were wholly inadequate to deal with the influx of casualties. At one stage, there were a fleet of ambulances all along the street, all in a queue trying to get to the hospital, so much so that the ambulance drivers got out and just ran with their stretchers from their parked ambulances to the hospital door because they simply couldn't get through the traffic jam. One nurse who had worked a night duty in the hospital wrote in her diary, which was later printed, and she said, "The smell of burning was in the air. The grass was strewn with blackened and charred paper. There was a sheet from a child's essay book. On the top of the page were the words, 'The end of the world.' It seemed appropriate. It was the end of the world as we knew it." Okay, so the impact on civilians obviously was huge. 220,000 people fled from the city and went to adjoining towns, whatever way they could. They got into cars, they were on bikes, they were on foot. They mobbed the city train station and the bus station, but obviously trains and buses filled up and they couldn't all be accommodated. The authorities tried to move expectant women and children out of the city in army lorries. There were open top lorries, and unfortunately the weather changed, so these poor sods were on the back of an open top lorry driven out of the city in the pouring rain and without any shelter. It just couldn't be avoided. The Northern Ireland authorities, obviously they were overwhelmed with what had happened in terms of fire and rescue, and appeal was made to the south, to the southern government, asking could they help. And as a result, they asked for fire brigade men, as it would have been almost excluded, there would have been all men. They were asked would they volunteer to go north in their fire tenders to help with the, if you like, the fire and rescue operation. And 71 men from stations in Dublin, in Drogheda, and in Dunleary stepped forward. In fact, more people volunteered than they could accommodate. They weren't able to allow them all to go, obviously, but they 71 of them did readily volunteer, and they headed north. They stayed there for nearly 3 days until they were relieved by fire crews coming over from the UK. I'm not absolutely sure. It is said that they had to return back across the border every night, that they didn't stay in Northern Ireland. They went back to Dundalk, were kept overnight, and then went back north again the following day. There may have been some issue there around their own safety because they were Southern Ireland crews. I really don't know if it even happened, but it may have just been that there simply wasn't even accommodation for them in Belfast, considering the state it was in. At the time, Eamon de Valera was Taoiseach, and he was very angry at what had happened. He protested to the German embassy, and the German Minister for Ireland was called to the Department of Foreign Affairs, and Dev let them know how angry he was at what had happened. But it's funny how something that you think would be inconsequential can have an impact, because about a week after the bombing, Dev was addressing a local common somewhere in the west of Ireland, actually in Castlebar, and he made a speech which was picked up by the Irish press, not the Irish press newspaper, by an Irish newspaper, which referred to his speech. And in his speech, he had referred to the people of Belfast as our people. A short extract from the speech was, he said, "In the past, and probably in the present too, a number of them did not see eye to eye with us politically, but they are our people. We are one and the same people, and their sorrows in the present instance are also our sorrows." Now, what was somewhat incredible to my mind about that is that when the war was over and the Allies had taken Berlin, they found papers in Goebbels' office. Goebbels, as you know, was the propaganda minister for the German High Command. And Goebbels had written to the German press, who had been triumphalist about the success of the Belfast raid. And Goebbels wrote to the German press under the orders of Hitler, saying, "Cool it on the Belfast reference," because De Valera had made this speech referring to them as our people. And he knew that De Valera had connections to Irish America, and he was afraid that it might bring America into the war. So it's incredible to think that the reach of a small common meeting had that impact in Germany and beyond to that point. There had been 4 raids in total. That had been, I think, the second or third one. The last raid occurred on the 4th of May, and this time the air raid sirens were sounded, and people got a chance to go to shelters and to get out of their homes. And on that night, 150 people died, which again is quite a high death rate, let's be fair, but compared to 900 in the other night, it was on the smaller scale. But if you think of it in total, 1,100 people were to die in total in the 4 raids that happened in Belfast. And that is actually 1/3 of the number that died in the 20 years of the Troubles. And we all talk about the terrible loss of life in the Troubles, and yet 1/3 of the total 20-year Troubles were to die in a matter of 4 weeks. So it gives you the idea of the scale of it. Just some more scenes there of Belfast. You know, there's some children waiting. The refugees, by the way, they flooded out of the cities. 500 of them went to Dublin and were put up by the Red Cross. Some of them went, if they had relatives in the countryside or could get out of the city, they did. And apparently then for quite a few nights after the bombing, families would leave at night, go to the fields and bring something to keep them warm, and slept in the fields adjoining the city overnight because they considered that it was safer. Now, just one story here. You're wondering why I'm showing you the picture of an elephant, I'm sure. If I just explain the story in the background to this about Sheila, the baby elephant. When after the first air raid had occurred, the authorities in Belfast City Zoo decided that there was a real risk here, that in the event of there being a bomb falling, if a bomb fell on the zoo, animals might in fact escape. If their shelters were damaged, animals might escape. And as a result, they reluctantly felt that the only thing they could do was they had to destroy a certain number of them. So they a number of dangerous animals were actually put down: 6 wolves, 1 puma, 1 tiger, 2 polar bears, and 1 black bear. They were all, if you like, euthanized. So it just, so there was no danger of them escaping and running around the city. Obviously a danger to civilians. But Sheila, the baby elephant, you see in the picture there, she was spared. Now, there was a zookeeper working there by the name of Denise Weston, and she was concerned that Sheila would be in the zoo, and if there was an air raid, she would be frightened by what happened. So believe it or not, Denise, the zookeeper, used to bring Sheila, the baby elephant, home every night. She actually walked her through the streets from the zoo to her home, which wasn't too far away, and to her home. There she is having some water in Denise's back garden. I think that's Denise with her mother. And she was kept in the garage overnight, fed and watered, and brought back to the zoo the following day. Now, this was supposed to be happening without knowledge of the zoo authorities, but I think we'd all be fairly sure that if you were walking a baby elephant every night through the streets of Belfast, somebody knew it was happening. And it did go on for some weeks, but unfortunately, Sheila was her own undoing, because she chased a dog one day in the street. A dog was barking at her and she ran at it. And whoever owned the dog complained to the zoo authorities, and Denise was told to desist from Sheila leaving the zoo every night. But apparently, if there was an air raid, if the air raid siren sounded, Denise would go back to the zoo and stay in the elephant enclosure with Sheila, patting her and stroking her and keeping her calm. Funny enough, that story never came to light, even during the years of the war. Obviously, so much going on. It was actually in the 1960s that word got out about this story, and a journalist researched it and did a documentary on Denise and Sheila, the baby elephant, and that's how the story came to light, some decades later. Okay, the thing was, a situation in Northern Ireland was to move a pace further in terms of the impact to local people when the US entered the war in December 1941. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor, they declared war on Japan and Germany at the same time when that occurred. And the first troops to arrive, the first troops to be sent to Europe, arrived into Northern Ireland from the United States as early as January in 1942. In total, 37,000 troops arrived in that January. And by the end of the war, a total of 300,000 US troops would have passed through Northern Ireland between 1942 and 1944, when they went on to the UK for the invasion of France and D-Day, or the invasion of Normandy in D-Day. So, sorry, there's another picture of Sheila. Sorry, I've misgiven you that one. Despite my efforts here, I'm missing my slides. Terrible. There's Sheila in the street with people saying hello to her. She used to do her tricks for them, apparently, and they used to talk to her. So here's the arrival of the US troops. You've already seen the slide showing you that the British troops were already there. Now, the US authorities were a bit concerned about how these soldiers would manage themselves in Northern Ireland, because for many of them, it was their first time even to leave the United States. And they felt they needed to give them a few warnings about how they behaved, so they wouldn't get themselves into any difficulty, particularly given that they knew there was a politically charged atmosphere in Northern Ireland because of the, if you like, the unionist nationalist divide. So they did give them a handbook. which was to explain how they were to behave towards the locals. And the handbook covered such issues as the North-South divide, what was the difference between Northern and Southern Ireland, the system of rounds in a bar, you know, that if someone buys you a drink, you buy a drink back, that's the way it's done. And they particularly warned them about drinking poaching. I think that might have been a bit of an urban myth that there was that much poaching about, but that was one of the warnings they were given about the poaching, because it can be, as we know, 100% proof from the wrong place. Probably if these guys, if any of them were from Kentucky, they could probably have given them a run for their money, because they were all good, was it moonshiners, if they came from that part of the world. But one piece of advice they were given, which was very sound and would be sound even again today, they told them, do not argue religion and do not argue politics. Just don't get drawn on those issues in Northern Ireland, far too heated, and could be quite difficult. At this point, I'm just reminded of a story that my father told. My father, as I say, he was unlucky. He was 21 in April 1939. And then when war broke out that autumn, he was conscripted as, you know, a prime age male. He was conscripted with the first wave of conscripts, I'd imagine. He ended up in France for a number of short weeks, 6-8 weeks before the fall of France, and then ended up being evacuated from about 20 miles away from Dunkirk, having sat on the beach for nearly 3 days with nothing to eat until he managed to get on a ship and get back. Anyway, he then was stationed in Northern Ireland from 1940 onwards, and that's where he met my mother, and they got married in 42. But he had a story to tell where he and another guy by the name of Liam Burke, I think, himself and Liam anyway were good friends, and the reason they had become friends was they were both Catholics in their regiment. There weren't many of them about, and they became friends because they used to go to mass together. And they were billeted just outside of Warren Point, and they went to church in Burn Chapel, which was a small country chapel out country road. So they were out there one Sunday at mass, and when they were walking back to their army base back down the country road, a car pulled up and a woman was driving. And she said, "Oh my God, it's marvelous to see the British soldiers in Northern Ireland. You're very welcome. It's just great to see you here." So I think we have a fair idea what her political background was when she was delighted to see British soldiers in Northern Ireland. So she said, "I come from a local farmhouse. Please get in and come back to my farmhouse and I'll give you breakfast." So she brought them back, and instead of their usual army rations, they had bacon and egg and, you know, fresh bread and butter. They couldn't believe their luck. They had a lovely breakfast. And then she piled them in the car and drove them back to their army barracks. And when she was dropping them off at the door, she said, again, "You know, you're very welcome here. And by the way, just while you're in Northern Ireland, I just want to warn you, watch out for the Catholics." And she never realized that she just fed 2 of them on their way from mass. I'd say if anyone had told her, she'd have been very, very annoyed. Okay. Going back to the American troops again, they were discouraged from boasting. Also, they were told, do not boast about the US Army, the military might of the US Army, and the better living conditions that you're used to in the States compared to what you're seeing in Northern Ireland, just so that it wouldn't cause any local tensions. So there's an army barracks. They were temporary, those, I can't remember what they call those huts now, but there was a word, and they were temporary army huts that were set up. So as you can see them all there, and they're in their rain gear, so they were beginning to experience the Irish weather. Another thing that they were warned about too was their attitude to women, and not to mistake friendliness with the willingness to engage socially. Nice way of putting it. Because, you know, people will be open and friendly with you, but that doesn't mean that they want to actually have a chat or anything like that. So don't mix up the two. And that was one of the warnings that they were given. They really brought a boost to the social life of the province. And very soon the church was, both churches were speaking out about condemning the behavior of local women who were, if you like, fraternizing with these soldiers in dance halls and bars. So there's 2 of your local women who are clearly, to my mind, looking rather tame, but that would have been considered dreadful behavior by the churches of the time. So the 2 women are being told, the women were being blamed. It's funny how they always blame women for misbehavior and never the men that they're with. Anyway, there you go. So another facet of the troops arriving was that there was quite a lot of rivalry between the British soldiers and the American soldiers. One good reason was that the American GIs were paid nearly 3 times the rate of a British soldier. And they also came with very, very desirable things such as chocolate, chewing gum, and women's nylons, which were in short supply in those days of, you know, in the days when you simply couldn't get your hands on things like that without the black market. The fact that they had those items were almost like currency. So there was quite a lot of tension between British and US soldiers. Probably broke into a couple of fist fights, but nothing too serious, I suppose. They were stationed in Northern Ireland for over 3 years, the GIs and the British soldiers, obviously. And at one time, it seemed like the whole province was one big military training ground because, there was just so many of them there, and their presence was to change social life forever. A bit like, a major event does have that impact in the way we talk now. Will the pandemic change how we work, how we live, etc.? So a big event like that has a way of changing life, and it never goes back. For example, in Britain, the fact that women were pressed into service in the munitions industry and to taking up roles vacated by men who had gone to war, that was the big change in terms of women returning to work then, because when the war was over, women did not want to go back into the homes and lose their jobs. So it was the start, if you like, of women believing that they were entitled to a place in the workforce because of that had happened. So all of this was over then by 1944 for Northern Ireland, because obviously with D-Day occurred on the 6th of June, but they were moving troops back to the UK mainland, if you like, from earlier on, from April and May, because they had to have it in situ. Nobody knew that it was going to happen on the 6th of June. Obviously, that would have been top secret and no one really knew when it would happen. But they were massing the troops in preparation for the invasion of Europe, which did occur then on the 6th of June. So all these soldiers left Northern Ireland, never to return in many cases, except for those who perhaps had met and married local women, which obviously happened. Okay. Right, just moving on. That was the situation in Northern Ireland. I'd like to talk a bit about the emergency, because obviously there was connections between what was happening in Northern Ireland and what was happening in the south, but they were known as two completely different things. In the south, it was known as the emergency. The reason the word emergency was attributed to it was that obviously the Irish Free State, as it was called at the time, were aware that a war on the scale in Europe, particularly involving the UK, was going to have some impact in the south. So they passed a thing called the Emergency Powers Act, and this gave them sweeping powers to introduce internment. And I think there were a number of IRA men interned because they were seen to be, if you like, trying to get in contact with the Nazi authorities, because seen like probably on the principle of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And because the IRA would have been enemies, if you like, of the British situation, they felt that made the Germans their friends. Anyway, quite a few IRA men were apparently interned during that time. There was censorship of the press and government correspondence, so the government could keep a tighter control of the country during that time. Now, Ireland was declared neutral, and the meaning of neutrality, we all know what it means, but effectively it was important, if you're a neutral country, that you don't display any sense of aligning with either side. And that was important for your neutrality to be respected. So the German and Japanese diplomatic missions in Dublin both remained open right through the war years. They didn't have to close. But yet I think we all know that Ireland, apparently, the Free State as it was described as being neutral on the side of the Allies, which, as we know, is a contradiction in terms. You can't be neutral on one side, but they were seen somewhat neutral on the side of the Allies. And in fact, during those years, 40,000 Irish men and some women joined the British Army to fight in the war, completely voluntarily, obviously no conscription, but they volunteered to fight in a war that they felt was a just war. And out of that 40,000, 5,000 of those had actually deserted from the Free State Army. The reason being they wanted to resign their commissions to join the British Army, and they simply weren't allowed. So they actually defected from the army and absconded, should I say, from the army. Those people were to suffer terribly for that decision, because when the war was over and they came back to Ireland, they were considered to have been deserters. They weren't allowed to get any state or government jobs, and they were denied pensions for a number of years. I think they were denied army pensions for the rest of their lives because of what they had done. They would say we didn't have a choice, the war was happening, but they did suffer for the decision that they made. Then De Valera came under a lot of pressure from Churchill. Now, Churchill and De Valera had history going back to the War of Independence, because Churchill in those days was just an ordinary MP, he wasn't Prime Minister. But back in those days, he had quite a strong opposition to the Irish, the Irish in the War of Independence. So he has quite a dislike of De Valera, and tended in his speeches to refer to him as Mr. De Valera in a particular tone. But part of the Anglo-Irish Agreement of 21 had allowed the British to retain 3 ports in Ireland for military use. And these ports were known as the treaty ports, and Collins, if you like, had signed up to that in the Anglo-Irish Agreement. However, after an economic war with Britain in the 1930s, the return of the treaty ports was negotiated to settle that economic war. And the British handed back the treaty ports in 1938. Quite incredible considering, like, within a year they were at war. So De Valera was asked to return the treaty ports to the British for use, so they could use them as North Atlantic ports. There was one in Spike Island, one in, I should have written this down because I've forgotten now, but there were three ports in the country of Ireland. Now the De Valera refused to hand them back. He said, "We are neutral, we're not getting involved." You can imagine it was quite a pressure on him. We were only 17 years independent at that stage. And even if he had wanted to, it would have been quite an unpopular decision, I'm sure. And it would have put the Irish in the eye of the storm. And probably we would have seen bombing raids on Ireland. Anyway, he refused to hand back the treaty ports, and Churchill hated him for that and made a lot of strong condemnation of him quite publicly over it. Another point too that was made in American newspapers was that because all of Europe was, if you like, practically all of Europe was under occupation by the Germans, that the only lights, and of course Russia had come into the war, well, it had sided with Germany initially, but then when the Germans turned on them, the Russians and Germans then ended up at war with each other. But it was reported in a US newspaper that the only lights on in Europe, because Europe was blacked out at night, for danger of bombings, the only lights on in the whole of Europe were in Dublin. Between Moscow and New York, there wasn't a single light burning at night except the lights of Dublin. And in fact, it's claimed and never been proven that the Germans used the lights of Dublin. The German bombers who attacked Northern Ireland had used the lights of Dublin and Drogheda up along the coast to find their way to Belfast. That's never been proven. So moving on then to this, the next big problem that the Irish had, if you like, in the south was prisoners of war. The prisoners of war ended up in Ireland because they were nearly all exclusively airmen, but also some German U-boat crews. What happened with the airmen was they'd be returning from a bombing raid and they would get lost, or they'd have a damaged aircraft and simply not be able to make it back. So a couple of, or quite a number of RAF RAF pilots, and later on German U-boat personnel and German pilots ended up in Ireland as prisoners of war. Now, initially, when British airmen crash landed in Ireland, and some crash landed and didn't survive it, and some were injured, but some, were able to walk away. Initially, the numbers of RAF were quite small, but any of them that crash landed in Ireland tended just to be handed back across the border. There was nothing thought of it because they were the only ones. However, when the Germans started to crash land, because they couldn't be handed back, they certainly couldn't be handed back to Northern Ireland, or they would have been handed back to the British, and you couldn't get them back off an island to Germany. So as a result, the Irish then had to be seen to imprison them all equally. So they set up a Curragh camp, and they set up the Curragh camp for both sides, for both German and British prisoners of war. And they simply had a fence running down the centre that anyone could nearly have vaulted over. So it was quite peaceful, considering that they were at war with one another, but they were both sides of this fence. The RAF guys tended to wear civilian clothes, and the Germans tended to stay in their uniform for whatever reason that it was. But they were both sides, as I say, of a fence in the Curragh camp. Now, they weren't known as prisoners of war, but they were actually known as guests of the state. Kind of a funny thing to call them, but that's what they're known as, guests of the state, as they stood either side of their 4-foot fence. They did actually at one stage play a football match with one another, and apparently Germany won by quite a high margin, something like 8-2 or something. So not like the current European football. I'm sure it went down very, 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 very badly though, but the Brits to be beaten so badly. So anyway, they had these guests of the nation, if you like, were in the camp. And because of where they were, and because we were a neutral country, they were not treated like typical prisoners of war. And in fact, they were allowed to leave the camp. They were allowed to go out and do things in the surrounding countryside if they liked. For instance, one RAF officer had his family come and visit him from Britain. In fact, a number of them had family visit them from Britain. One officer had his horse brought over to Ireland, and he used to go fox hunting in the surrounding countryside. If they left the camp, They had to give their word of honour that they would return. I know this sounds a bit like a script from Faulty Towers, but this is the truth. They had to give the word of honour and sign that in a book, giving their word of honour that they would return. And that was the basis on which it was done. Now, they also were allowed to visit pubs locally. Of course, they could have had money sent to them by family. And apparently there was an actual currency brought out. They were issued with a special currency which applied to the Curragh camp inmates, so people would know who they were. So money was exchanged for the local for the Curragh camp currency. They were allowed to go out to local pubs, but so that there wouldn't be a row between both sides, they had both German soldiers went to one pub and RAF went to other ones. They never mixed them, and this is the way that they managed it. Now, but at one case, how difficult it was, how mad the whole thing was. At one stage, the Germans had a court-martial for one of their own who they felt had done something treasonous. I don't know what it was, but he was considered to have committed treason. And they decided to have a court-martial where he was found guilty and he was sentenced to be executed. So they asked the Irish army who were in charge of the camp for a gun with one bullet so they could shoot him. And they were refused because they weren't going to be handed a bullet with a gun in it under the circumstances. So the guy had the lucky escape. They weren't able to execute him because they couldn't get a gun with the bullet. This is true. I'm not making this up. Now, there's one person here. There's the German group there. If you see, the RAF are a mixture of civilian and local dress in some cases. There you have the German people, and they're all in their uniform. Apparently, they chose to stay in uniform. Maybe they felt very alienated from where they were. There's the Curragh Camp Bar where they were able to use their currency. That was a Curragh bar actually, and that one was run on an honour system. So what you did there, when you took a drink, you signed a book to say, I owe you for one whiskey or whatever. And then you had to settle up your chit at the end of the week. And apparently that's how it worked. Now this rather dashing looking man is a person by the name of Roland Wolfe, and he had quite a funny story. Roland Wolfe was actually an American, and he joined the RAF in 1939 because he wanted to get involved in the war. Apparently, he had to relinquish his US citizenship to do that. I'm surprised that would have happened. I didn't think the Irish who joined the British Army had to relinquish their citizenship, but apparently he had to. Now he crash landed in Donegal. He was flying back for the RAF from a sortie out over the North Atlantic, and he crashed in Donegal and was taken to the Curragh camp because he landed in the Free State, if you like. Now, he hadn't joined the army in 1939 as a volunteer to sit in the Curragh camp in 1940 for the rest of the war, so he was determined to escape. Because of this word of honour he had to give, what he did was he went out of the camp, signed the book to say he'd given his word of honour, but then he came back a few minutes later claiming to have forgotten something, and he went back in, left a second time, and when he left the second time, he didn't sign the book, so he felt that had relinquished him from his responsibility on his word of honour. He made his way to Dublin, got on a train to Belfast and presented himself back to his regiment. Delighted with himself, he was now back to join up. To his absolute horror, when they saw him and knew who he was, they said, you shouldn't have done that. The neutrality of Ireland, Southern Ireland, is very important in the war effort. And if word got out that we let you come back here having escaped in Ireland, in Southern Ireland, that could be difficult. So they actually handed him back to the Irish authorities, and he ended up back in the Curragh camp, having gone to all that trouble. He was disgusted. Apparently, he did make one more attempt at escaping. He was recaptured in Kildare, somewhere not too far from the camp. And after that, he just decided to pack it in. Apparently, though, in the later years, when the war started to turn, where it looked like, the Germans, I don't think it was as late as 1944, but when it looked like, the war was turning against Germany, at that stage, the Irish authorities started to allow the British soldiers and the British RAF men to go back across the border to the north. The Germans they had to keep. The Germans had no way of getting back to Germany anyway. They were on an island, and they just had to sit out the war. At the end of the war, nearly a third of them actually remained on in Ireland. They had got involved, maybe had married locally. A number of them were allowed to go to college in Dublin, apparently, and live in digs. And even before the end of the war, so many of them didn't actually go back to Germany. If they didn't have maybe wives and children to return to, they just stayed where they were. But I have one last comment about, or one story. I think this might be a bit of a, as I call it, a hairy dog story. I don't know if it's quite true. I can't actually confirm it. But it was the story of one RAF pilot who, like I mentioned to you earlier, there were the German pubs and the English pubs that these guys used to drink in. And one RAF pilot was lost. He was coming back from a bombing raid in somewhere in Europe. He was completely lost in low cloud, wasn't quite sure where he was, but he hoped he was over Wales or England or whatever. But in fact, he was over Ireland. and he crash landed in Kildare, somewhere in Kildare. He wasn't injured, thankfully. He got out of his cockpit and started walking to see who he could find someone to help him. And he came across a pub. And this guy obviously was in his RAF uniform. He just got out of a military bomber. He walked into this pub, not sure where he was, only to find it was full of German soldiers in full uniform. And they turned around, saw him coming in the door, took him to be someone from the camp and said, "Get out of here and go to your own pub," in English. So you can imagine how dismayed he was. He didn't know where the hell he was. Why were there English-speaking Germans in a pub? Anyway, as I say, it's not, I'm not entirely sure if it's a true story, but as we say in tour guiding, never ruin a good story with the truth. Okay, but as I say, back to the point about Irish neutrality, there's definitely evidence that there was bias in the Irish government circles towards the Allies, that their hearts were more on the side of the Allies than they ever were on the Axis power side. For instance, weather reports were supplied to the British for the D-Day landings. Again, nobody knew the exact date, but they did supply weather reports. And you may have even seen, a couple of weeks ago was on the evening news, the woman who produced the weather report in Blacksod Met Office in Mayo back in June of 1944, she actually spotted that there was going to be a North Atlantic storm coming in that was due to hit the UK on the 5th of June. And the 5th of June was the original date that the Allies planned for the invasion of France. And because of that Met Office report that was supplied, they put it off by a day so that the sea crossings and the low cloud would have changed by the time they couldn't have gone ahead with the invasion in low cloud because the aircraft needed to be able to see what they were doing, and they certainly didn't need rough seas. So that Met Office supply was a big help to them in their planning. And that woman concerned, she's an old lady, 93 I think, and she's in a home now in Mayo, and someone came from the American embassy, I think, and she was actually given an award only there about 3 or 4 weeks ago. I don't know what kept them so long, but there you are. It happened a few weeks ago and she was on the TV. She's still alive, but well up in years. There was a lot of cooperation between the Irish and British intelligence service right throughout the war, and the Chief of Staff of the Irish Defence Forces travelled to Northern Ireland on quite a number of occasions, and he met with high-ranking British Army personnel, probably passing over some kind of intelligence they would have picked up. I know too that the German embassy was found to have a radio in it, which they shouldn't have had, and the Irish authorities became aware of that. They were clearly sending information back from from the radio to Berlin, and the Irish authorities went in and confiscated it, which was probably again somewhat of a breach of neutrality. But anyway, they did it. So one thing that wouldn't have been known throughout the emergency, everyone was worried about what would happen. But there were, in fact, 2 plans to invade the Free State, which is now the Republic of Ireland, obviously, 2 separate plans. Each side had a plan. The Plan W was the British plan, and that was that the British would invade Ireland to prevent the Germans from doing so. Because remember, if the Germans had invaded Ireland, they would have had the British in a pincer movement. They were there in Holland and France, and then they would have been in Ireland, and Britain would have been caught between the two. So if they thought that the Germans were going to invade Ireland, any indication of that, they would have invaded Ireland to get there ahead of them and to hold it. And equally, there was a separate plan then by the German side, and they planned to, at least as a diversionary tactic, to invade Ireland with a small force, so that would get the British distracted, looking west, if you like, instead of looking east, and then they would have mounted the bigger attack from the east. Anyway, neither plan ever happened, as we know, and we were never invaded. But you would have to think, had Britain, for instance, had Britain fallen to the Nazis in, say, 1939 or 1940, presumably they would have also come across to Northern Ireland, since it was part of the UK, and there would have been situations there like Harland and Wolff, etc., that they would have wanted to control. And you would have to ask yourself, had the Germans invaded Northern Ireland, would they have let the porous barrier of our border, would they have left that porous border sit there? I really doubt it, with 180 unofficial crossings. So chances are we would have had German occupation of the whole island, because that would be the only way they could have been sure they were securing it from that side. Okay, so that's the end of the slides as such, in terms of poor old Roland at the end. Roland, I understand, did get handed back before the end of the war, so he probably got to fly a few more times. I've no idea how he ended up and if he survived the war, but he seemed very keen to be part of it anyway. Anyway, just in closing, and I am coming to the end, I'd just like to say at this stage, because we've talked about, you know, munitions and death rates and bombings and wars and all the rest, but like wars happen at a very broad level. We tend to think of them in a macro way, but obviously all wars are just a series of thousands and thousands of tragic stories. People who lose family lives, people who lose their living, their homes, and greater tragedies than that, God knows, occurred. I mean, the Russians lost 20 million people in the war, and was it a total of 80 million people in total were to die in the Second World War throughout the whole of Europe, both military and civilian casualties. So it was a terrible, terrible tragedy beyond anything we've ever seen, and I hope we never see the like of it again. And in fairness, you've heard everything I've said has been from, if you like, the Allied side of the story, but we know too that Germany was pulverized in the latter part of the war years. Dresden was flattened, Berlin was practically flattened. Terrible bombing raids were to occur in those later years. That last year, Hitler refused to capitulate and went to the very, very end when it was obviously hopeless. So the German civilians took a terrible hammering during those years. So it was really dreadful. But just to put it down, as I say, finally to a personal level and how it affected, you know, my reason I took this interest was because I had grown up with it, because of my father being in the British Army, meeting my mother in Northern Ireland, getting married there in 1942. They got married in 1942, and my mother discovered she was expecting my older sister Sheila in the early part of 1944. She was actually 3 months pregnant when my father was sent back to France. It was probably May of 1944, because they were massing the troops in Britain with the expectation that the invasion of France was imminent, which did happen then on the 6th of June. So he had to leave my mother, who was 3 months pregnant in Northern Ireland. She had to say goodbye without really knowing what was to happen. Would he ever be seen again? Luckily, he was with the supply. The regiment he was in were Royal Engineers, and they were on the supply end of things. So he didn't actually go into France until the 8th of June. So if you like, he missed the first two very serious days, and the bodies piling on the beaches with the start of the invasion. He was then bogged down in France in what they call the Battle of the Bulge, and it was nearly 9 months before he actually managed to get back on any kind of leave. But my sister was born on the 4th of December. He would have known the baby should have been born by then, but you know, communications weren't what they are today. There was no instant communications. You got your letters when you got your letters. And he in fact got a letter on New Year's Day of 1945 to say, from my grandmother, saying the baby had been born, everything was well, mother and child, and everything was grand. So my sister was nearly a month old before he even knew about her. He just had to wait and hope that he would hear. So I think it just sort of summarizes, that's one small story of one man who was living his life as a 21-year-old in England with, you know, nothing too exciting happening. His life was to change hugely by decisions made by politicians thousands of miles away. Anyway, I've come to the end of my story in terms of what happened. I've kept to the time. I'm very pleased with myself. I've managed it in under the hour. And if there are any questions that you want to ask me, you're certainly welcome to do so. If you want to know who won, spoiler alert, I can tell you who won. Anyway, if you have any questions, but I hope we gave you some kind of an indication of what happened. And I hope, like me, that you come to realise that, you know, our separated brethren, if you like, in Northern Ireland, were through quite an experience that very many of us simply don't know about or appreciate. So thank you very much for listening.
Well done, Aveen, that was great.
Okay.
Well done, thanks a million.
Yeah, okay.
Very good. We had about 40 people, nearly 40 people listen to you. I don't have any questions so far, just a few, a couple of comments. Yeah, thank you for your talks. And as Beverly was saying, it's amazing that Ireland, the Free State wasn't invaded. It's, you know, it should have been really, I suppose, it's the most logical thing to do from either side was to invade us. Yeah, the Nissan, they're called the Nissan huts. You were saying, yeah. I remember them myself. They were actually talking about a program about that on the TV last week. It was about the start. It was about Northern Ireland after the war. It was called the Living Border. I think it was very interesting. And they were saying how you know, all the councils in the north after the war were very sectarian, as we know, and the Protestants were all housed in the house building boom, and the Catholics were put in those Nissan huts for years. They lived right up until the 50s. They were housed in those old war Nissan huts. Yeah, no, I don't know if anyone want to ask a question or comment or whatever. No. Oh, you can all unmute yourselves if anybody, if you're still awake, you can unmute yourself if you want to ask anything or say anything. But very good comments. Everyone's very interested in the talk. Yeah, Hitler had a green plan to invade Ireland, and I believe the actual plan is in the museum in Monaghan. Oh,
all right.
And there's supposed to be unbelievable information on Ireland. Oh, that's very good.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, as you say, they're like the embassy was open all the time, so there would have been a lot of stuff going on, I'm sure.
Yeah,
very good comments. I don't see any, and nobody has any questions. Oh, somebody, Maria's mum was a member of the Red Cross in Dublin, and her and her colleagues tended to the wounded who came off the train at Amiens Street. That's after the bombing, the Belfast Blitz.
Okay, she really must have, yeah. That was quite an experience, I'm sure, yeah. We also know too about the German embassy. De Valera went to the German embassy and gave his condolences on the death of Hitler.
That's right.
Because he felt, well, that's what I have to do. I'm a neutral country and I would do it. If anybody had died, I have to do that. But it is said that in later years, particularly when he found out about things that had happened, like the camps, etc., that he was really sorry that he had done that and quite embarrassed at his decision that he made to go.
So everyone, I probably all want to go and see the news.
Yeah.
So if nobody's anything to say, we'll sign off.
No, it's just it was terribly interesting, and it's the sort of material you need to kind of digest a bit, before you can kind of think of things to ask. But thank you so much, Aveen. I think from my point of view as an American, it's very edifying to find out about the war from this perspective that was entirely unknown to me. Thank you so very much.
Actually,
a topic I know nothing about.
No.
Absolutely nothing. I've heard about the fire engines roaring up there, and that's it. Like I didn't even know about the casualties being so high.
Yeah.
We had great stories in our house about the smuggling that went on, because when the Yanks turned up, as Aveen said, they had nylon stockings and chewing gum, and they used to the local citizens in the north would bring all that stuff down to the south across the border, and transfer it over here for goodies that they hadn't gotten in the north, foodstuffs, and for instance. So my mum has great stories about smuggling across the border, especially when my sister was born, and they used to smuggle stuff underneath the false bottom of those big old prams that they used to have.
Oh wow!
The customs man wouldn't pick up a baby, so you could smuggle stuff in the false bottoms of the prams. I think she said she crossed my eldest sister crossed the border with an American watch on her from one of the soldiers to swap in the south for stuff.
I think our grandmother used to smuggle whiskey in hot water bottles, pour the whiskey into a hot water bottle, carry it under our clothes, and then rebottle it on the other side and sell it then probably to American GIs who had no idea that it had come through in a hot water bottle.
I'm sure it didn't taste any different anyway.
No, I'm sure not, no.
Yeah, so that's it. I'll save the chat and I pass them on to Aveen. And thanks very much for your chatting. And I'll have a good nice walk now after all that.
Yeah, enjoy doing it. Glad to do it. Okay.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks for your attention.
Thanks a million.
Bye.
Have a lovely summer, guys. We see you in person, hopefully, at some things.
Okay.
Yeah, bye.
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 Thanks, kids.
Thank you. Bye bye.